The streets of Victorian London bustled with life. Horses clattering on cobblestones, factory whistles piercing the air, gas lamps flickering through the fog. Yet behind that energy lay a shadow that touched nearly every family: illness. In an age before modern antibiotics, before safe anesthesia, and before reliable sanitation, medicine was a fragile mix of hope, tradition, and trial. Doctors wore black coats and carried leather bags filled with mysterious bottles. Surgeons wielded shining instruments, often without gloves, in operating rooms where speed mattered more than precision. Pharmacies displayed rows of glass jars, their contents ranging from healing herbs to dangerous chemicals. And for the poor, healing was often left to home remedies, folk cures, or sheer endurance. Victorian medicine was as fascinating as it was terrifying. Hospitals grew larger, but infection stalked their wards. Doctors experimented, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes recklessly, while patients clung to trust in science that was still finding its footing. For every breakthrough, there were failures, and for every life saved, many more were lost to diseases we now cure with ease. Tonight, we step into that world, into dimly lit surgeries, crowded tenements where sickness spread quickly, and lecture halls where physicians debated the future of their craft. We will explore what medicine was truly like in Victorian London, from the tools and treatments to the everyday struggles of patients and doctors alike. So settle in. Let the story unfold slowly. And before we begin this journey through the shadows and discoveries of the past, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these calming histories alive. In the crowded heart of Victorian London, where carriages rattled past soot-blackened buildings and fog rolled in thick from the Thames, there was one figure who both fascinated and terrified the public: the surgeon. To many, the surgeon was a man of remarkable courage, stepping into the darkest moments of human suffering armed with little more than steel instruments and a steady hand. To others, he was a grim reaper in a black coat, working in rooms that smelled of carbolic acid or, worse, blood and sweat. For in the first half of the 19th century, surgery was not yet the precise, carefully controlled discipline it would later become. It was a race against time, a desperate act in which speed mattered more than science, and where every incision carried the shadow of danger. Hospitals in London were expanding during the Victorian era, their wards filling with the sick and the injured drawn from the city's rapidly growing population. Yet operating theaters in these institutions bore little resemblance to the clean, sterile rooms we imagine today. They were amphitheaters, sometimes literally, with tiered seating for students and curious onlookers. Light filtered through grimy windows, instruments gleamed on wooden tables, and the air was heavy with anticipation. When a surgeon prepared to operate, dozens of eyes watched, the room hushed except for the rasp of metal against leather as knives were drawn from their cases. For the patient, the experience was terrifying. Anesthesia was not introduced until the mid-19th century, and even then, it was slow to be trusted and inconsistently applied. Before its arrival, patients were restrained, sometimes by several strong assistants, as the surgeon began his work. Screams echoed through the theater, a sound that haunted all who heard it. The surgeon's only mercy was his speed. A skilled practitioner could amputate a limb in under 2 minutes, some in less than 1. There are stories of surgeons removing a leg in under 30 seconds, their hands moving in a blur, saw biting through bone as assistants struggled to hold the writhing patient still. To those who witnessed it, such speed was both horrifying and astonishing, a performance in which life and death balanced on the edge of a blade. But speed had its limits. Infection was the true enemy of Victorian surgery. Long before germ theory was widely accepted, wounds frequently turned septic. Surgeons wore their black coats like uniforms, the fabric stiff with layers of dried blood from countless previous operations. Their instruments, once wiped on a sleeve or dipped in cold water, were used again and again. Patients often left the operating table alive, only to succumb days later to infection, fevers rising, wounds oozing, bodies wasting away. Mortality rates were grim, and for many families, surgery was a last resort taken only when death without it was certain. Yet despite these dangers, surgeons were admired for their courage and their skill. They were men of action in an era when medicine was still often mired in uncertainty. While physicians prescribed tonics and debated theories, surgeons could at least be seen doing something tangible, removing a tumor, setting a bone, or saving a life by amputating a crushed limb. Their reputation was one of determination, even if the outcomes were uncertain. Crowds gathered in operating theaters not only to learn, but to marvel at the audacity of these men who dared to cut into the body in hopes of saving it. The introduction of anesthesia in the 1840s changed surgery forever, but at first it was met with suspicion. Ether and chloroform promised relief from pain, but they also carried risks of suffocation or sudden death. Surgeons, long accustomed to working against the clock, now found themselves able to slow down, to operate with greater care. Still, it took years before the use of anesthesia became standard practice in London hospitals, and even longer for it to be accepted in rural areas. During this period of transition, some patients begged for the new method, while others feared it, believing unconsciousness might bring them closer to death than the knife itself. Even with anesthesia, infection remained a constant shadow until the work of pioneers like Joseph Lister in the 1860s introduced antiseptic techniques. Lister's ideas, inspired by the emerging germ theory, involved cleaning wounds with carbolic acid, sterilizing instruments, and encouraging cleanliness in surgical theaters. At first, his methods were mocked. Many surgeons resisted the idea that invisible organisms could be responsible for infection. Yet gradually, evidence built up, survival rates improved, and antiseptic practices spread. For the first time, surgery began to offer genuine hope rather than a desperate gamble. But in the earlier decades of Victorian London, when Lister's discoveries were still years away, surgery was a spectacle of speed and nerve. Surgeons carried with them sets of polished knives, saws, and forceps, instruments designed for efficiency rather than subtlety. They developed reputations based on how quickly they could operate, how decisively they could cut, how many patients survived under their hand. Some became almost legendary, their names spoken with awe in medical schools and whispered in dread by patients. A fast surgeon was a good surgeon, for in those days, speed was the closest thing to mercy. The atmosphere of an operating theater in London was unforgettable. Students crowded close, notebooks in hand, eager to learn. Spectators leaned forward, straining to see every movement. Assistants held down the patient, sweat beading on their brows. The surgeon, focused and steady, worked with knives honed sharp and saws ready. Each movement was deliberate, honed through years of practice. And when the operation was complete, when the limb was gone or the tumor removed, a cheer sometimes rose from the crowd, not in cruelty, but in recognition of the feat accomplished. For those present, surgery was not only medicine but performance, and its practitioners were both healers and showmen. For the ordinary Londoner, the thought of surgery was terrifying. Many delayed treatment until it was too late, fearing the knife more than the illness. Stories of patients who never woke, who lingered in agony, or who died from infection spread quickly through neighborhoods. Yet for those with no other hope, surgery was a chance worth taking. To lose a limb but save a life was a bargain many reluctantly accepted. Families prepared themselves for the worst, prayed for survival, and watched anxiously as loved ones were carried into the theater. In this way, Victorian surgery was a paradox. It represented both the bravery and the brutality of medicine in its time. Surgeons were figures of skill and daring, Yet their work unfolded in conditions that we now view with horror. They operated in a world without the safeguards we take for granted, guided by instinct, experience, and a relentless drive to act. Their legacy is complex. They were both feared and admired. Their work both life-saving and perilous. And so, in the gaslit streets of Victorian London, where sickness was common and remedies uncertain, the surgeon stood as a symbol of medicine's struggle between tradition and progress, between fear and hope. Each operation was a gamble, each decision a race against death, each movement a reminder that in those years, surgery was less about science than about speed. It was raw, it was dangerous, and it was unforgettable. The beginning of a journey that would, in time, lead to the modern operating room, but which, in its own day, was as much theater as it was healing. In the winding streets of Victorian London, where gas lamps flickered against the fog and the hum of industry filled the air, physicians occupied a curious place in society. They were both respected professionals and, at times, distrusted figures whose treatments could be as dangerous as the illnesses they sought to cure. Medicine in this period was caught between old traditions and new discoveries. Theories of the body and disease were shifting, but not yet firmly established. Physicians prescribed remedies drawn from centuries of practice, often blending genuine knowledge with guesswork. For patients, visiting a doctor was an act of hope, but one never free of risk. Physicians in Victorian London were divided by class and reputation. At the top stood the elite practitioners, men educated at universities like Oxford or Cambridge, members of the Royal College of Physicians, who attended to wealthy families in their well-furnished homes. These doctors wore tailored coats, carried polished instruments, and charged fees that only the privileged could afford. For the poor, there were general practitioners with less formal training, or apothecaries who dispensed medicines while also offering advice. At the very bottom were quacks and street healers, who promised miraculous cures from stalls or through advertisements plastered across newspapers. Together, this spectrum of healers formed the medical landscape of London, a city in which health was not only a science, but also a business. The remedies physicians prescribed often reflected the theories that dominated medicine at the time. The ancient idea of humors, balancing blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, still lingered in medical thinking, though it was gradually giving way to new understandings. Yet treatments often remained harsh. Bleeding, blistering, and purging were common methods, intended to rid the body of excess or imbalance. Leeches were applied to draw blood, mustard plasters placed on skin to provoke inflammation, and laxatives administered in strong doses. Patients endured these treatments not because they were pleasant, but because they were what medicine had long prescribed. Alongside these traditional methods came an array of potions and tonics. Physicians and apothecaries prescribed mixtures of herbs, minerals, and chemicals, each promising relief. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was perhaps the most widely used. It soothed pain, calmed coughing, and eased sleeplessness, making it a household staple across classes. Mothers gave it to children for teething, doctors prescribed it for fevers, and the weary used it to find rest. Yet its addictive power was poorly understood, and countless lives were quietly shaped by dependence upon it. Other remedies included calomel, a mercury-based compound used as a laxative, and various bitters infused with alcohol and herbs. Some helped, others harmed, and all were accepted as part of the uncertain art of healing. Apothecaries played a central role in Victorian medicine. Their shops were crowded with jars of powders, bundles of herbs, and glass bottles filled with liquids of every color. Customers came seeking both advice and supplies. An apothecary might prepare a tonic for a cough, a poultice for a wound, or a draught for sleeplessness. They measured, mixed, and prescribed, bridging the gap between the physician and the household. For many Londoners, The apothecary was the first stop when illness struck, a familiar figure whose remedies were trusted because they were accessible. In this way, apothecaries were both healers and businessmen, their counters serving as stages for the daily drama of health and survival. The business side of medicine flourished in Victorian London. Advertisements filled newspapers with promises of miracle cures, pills to restore vigor, elixirs to extend life, syrups to cure coughs, powders to ease stomach troubles. These products were often marketed with bold claims and dramatic testimonials, appealing to a population eager for relief. Some were harmless mixtures of sugar and herbs, others dangerous concoctions laced with alcohol, opium, or heavy metals. Patent medicines, as they were called, became immensely profitable, their names becoming household words. For every family that benefited from them, another suffered from their side effects. But the business thrived regardless. Physicians themselves were not immune to the lure of commerce. Some endorsed patent medicines, lending their names to advertisements. Others charged high fees for home visits, turning medical care into a luxury for the wealthy. For the poor, charitable hospitals and dispensaries offered limited care, often overcrowded and underfunded. Many relied on self-treatment, home remedies passed down through generations, or the advice of neighbors. In this way, medicine in Victorian London was not only about knowledge and skill, but also about money and access. Health was unevenly distributed. Its cost a burden that weighed most heavily on the poor. Yet it would be wrong to see Victorian physicians only as merchants of uncertain cures. Many were deeply committed to advancing knowledge, experimenting with new techniques, and improving care. This was a period of transition, when the old world of humors and traditional remedies was giving way to the new world of science and laboratory discovery. Physicians began to embrace stethoscopes, recently invented, which allowed them to listen to the inner workings of the body. They studied pathology, examining tissues under microscopes, searching for the causes of disease. They debated the role of sanitation, nutrition, and environment in health. These were the seeds of modern medicine, though their fruits were still years away. For patients, the experience of visiting a physician could vary wildly. A wealthy family might receive a doctor in their parlor, where he would take a pulse, examine a tongue, and prescribe a tonic, leaving behind a bill and a sense of reassurance. A working-class mother might visit an apothecary, explaining her child's cough and receiving a bottle of syrup that soothed but did not cure. A desperate laborer might fall prey to a quack in the street, who promised healing for a few pennies but delivered little more than empty hope. In all these encounters, the common thread was uncertainty. Medicine could offer relief, but it could not guarantee it. The body remained mysterious, its ailments resistant to easy answers. The relationship between physician and patient was shaped as much by trust as by science. In an age before clear evidence-based medicine, belief in a doctor's wisdom was often as powerful as the remedies themselves. Patients sought comfort as much as cures, reassurance that their suffering was being recognized and addressed. Physicians, for their part, relied on authority, presenting themselves as learned men whose presence alone could inspire confidence. The black coat, the leather bag, the measured tone, these became part of the performance of medicine, symbols that carried weight even when treatments faltered behind the scenes. Debates raged in medical societies and journals. Should bleeding still be practiced? Were new chemical remedies safer than the old herbal ones? Could diseases be caused by invisible organisms, as some now speculated? These questions revealed a profession in flux, struggling to reconcile tradition with discovery. Victorian London, with its vast population and constant flow of illness, served as both laboratory and battleground for these ideas. Physicians tested, argued, and published, their theories shaping the lives of countless patients to in the end. Medicine in Victorian London was a mixture of earnest effort, commercial enterprise, and uncertain knowledge. Physicians carried the weight of responsibility, yet their tools were limited, their remedies inconsistent, and their understanding incomplete. For patients, every prescription was a leap of faith, every potion a gamble. And yet, in the dimly lit rooms of homes and hospitals, in the bustling shops of apothecaries, and in the noisy streets where hawkers sold patent cures, medicine was a constant presence, imperfect, flawed, but indispensable. It was through this uneasy mixture of tradition and innovation, commerce and compassion, that Victorian medicine slowly moved toward the future. Physicians, with all their limitations, laid the groundwork for modern practice, while patients, with all their endurance, carried the burden of uncertainty. Together, they formed the landscape of healing in London, a world where potions and promises coexisted with genuine progress, and where medicine was as much about survival as it was about science. Victorian London's hospitals stood as towering institutions of both hope and dread. They were places where the poorest sought help when all else failed, where physicians honed their skills, and where medical science inched forward through trial and error. Yet for patients, a hospital visit was often a gamble. The stone walls and wide wards symbolized care, but inside, the realities of treatment could be grim. In an age before antibiotics, before consistent antiseptic practice, and before professional nursing became standard, hospitals were as much places of suffering as they were of healing. To step through their doors was to enter a world of crowded beds, pungent smells, constant noise, and uncertain outcomes. London's rapid growth in the 19th century had swelled its population beyond what traditional systems of care could handle. Families that once relied on home remedies or local healers found themselves overwhelmed by the spread of disease in the dense neighborhoods of the industrial city. Hospitals, many founded in earlier centuries as charitable institutions, expanded their wards and added new buildings, but the demand always exceeded the supply. Beds were lined up side by side, with barely enough space for attendants to move between them. Windows let in pale light, and in winter, cold drafts swept through, chilling already weak patients. In summer, the air grew stifling, heavy with odors of sweat, sickness, and disinfectant. Sanitation was inconsistent. Before the widespread acceptance of germ theory, many believed that foul smells, the infamous miasmas, caused illness. Efforts were made to improve ventilation, to burn incense or sprinkle lime to mask odors, but the true causes of infection remained unchecked. Surgeons moved from one patient to another without washing their hands, their coats stiff with dried blood. Instruments, once used on one patient, were quickly reused on the next. In such conditions, even minor procedures could lead to deadly infections. Hospitals became notorious for hospital fever, a vague but terrifying term that covered the many infections patients contracted while inside. Families whispered that entering a hospital often meant never coming out. Despite these conditions, hospitals were also places of progress. They gathered together physicians, surgeons, and students, creating an environment where ideas could be shared and knowledge advanced. New techniques were tested, and innovations slowly spread. The introduction of anesthesia, for instance, was first demonstrated in hospital theaters, changing the face of surgery forever. Later, antiseptic practices pioneered by Joseph Lister began in hospital wards, gradually transforming survival rates. For all their dangers, hospitals were laboratories of modern medicine, where lives were risked but discoveries were made. The experience of a patient in a Victorian hospital varied greatly, depending on class and circumstance. Wealthier patients could afford private rooms or treatment in specialized wards, where conditions were somewhat better, with more attentive staff and cleaner surroundings. For the poor, the general wards were overcrowded, noisy, and chaotic. Patients of all ages lay side by side, the elderly beside children, the fevered beside the wounded, the dying beside the recovering. Privacy was non-existent, and rest was difficult amid the groans, coughs, and cries that filled the air. Visiting hours were limited, leaving patients isolated from family, dependent entirely on the care of overworked staff. Nursing in the early Victorian period was often unskilled, carried out by women with little training, sometimes recruited from the lowest rungs of society. They tended fires, changed linens, and delivered food, but they were not yet professionals in the modern sense. Florence Nightingale's reforms during the Crimean War would later revolutionize nursing, bringing discipline, training, and sanitation to the forefront. But in the decades before her influence spread fully through London, nursing was inconsistent. Some attendants were kind and diligent, others neglectful or rough. Their presence a reminder that compassion alone could not substitute for training. The hospital was also a place of teaching, where students crowded into galleries to watch operations. For them, the wards were living classrooms, filled with cases to study, bodies to examine, and opportunities to learn. Patients, however, often felt more like specimens than individuals. Their illnesses were discussed in detail before audiences of strangers, their bodies exposed during examinations, their conditions noted in clinical detail. For many, this lack of dignity added to the suffering of their stay. Yet it was through such observation that medical knowledge expanded, shaping the practices that would eventually bring better care. Charity played a significant role in the running of hospitals. Many relied on donations from wealthy benefactors who expected gratitude and recognition in return. Patients sometimes had to obtain letters of recommendation from patrons or employers to be admitted, turning medical care into a matter of social favor. Once inside, they were expected to conform to strict rules, with misbehavior risking expulsion. Discipline extended to diet as well. Meals were plain and limited, designed more to control costs than to nourish. A typical patient might receive bread, broth, and weak tea, with meat only on rare occasions. Hunger lingered even within walls meant for healing. The sounds and sights of a Victorian hospital left strong impressions on those who entered. The clang of buckets, the shuffle of feet on stone floors, the cries of patients in pain, the sharp scent of carbolic acid once it came into use, all created an atmosphere that was overwhelming. Families dreaded sending loved ones there, yet for many, there was no alternative. A broken bone, a severe fever, or a dangerous childbirth could not be managed at home. The hospital, for all its risks, was the only place where skilled hands and some chance of survival could be found. Amid the harshness, there were moments of humanity. A nurse offering comfort to a frightened child, a surgeon pausing to reassure a trembling patient, a volunteer reading aloud to someone too weak to lift a book. These small acts brought relief in a setting that could otherwise feel cold and impersonal. They also hinted at the changes to come. As the culture of hospitals slowly shifted from mere management of illness to genuine care for the whole person, that be why the end of the Victorian era, hospitals had begun to transform. Sanitation improved, antiseptic practices spread, and nursing became a respected profession. Survival rates rose, and the fear associated with hospitals lessened. Yet in the early decades, when London's population was booming and medicine was still finding its way, the hospital was a place of contradictions. It was both a beacon of progress and a chamber of suffering, a space where lives were saved and lost in equal measure, and where every patient who entered carried with them the heavy uncertainty of whether they would ever walk out again, that eye in the end. The Victorian hospital was a mirror of the society it served, crowded, unequal, struggling with poverty and disease, yet striving toward improvement. Its harsh realities shaped the experiences of countless Londoners, leaving behind stories of endurance, tragedy, and occasional triumph. Victorian London was a city of contrasts. Glittering ballrooms and gaslit theaters stood beside alleys choked with refuse. where whole families crammed into single damp rooms. It was a place of innovation and industry, yet also a breeding ground for disease. The rapid growth of the city, fueled by industrialization, created crowded slums where sanitation barely existed. Human waste flowed into the Thames, cesspits leaked beneath homes, and water supplies were often tainted. Against this backdrop, the struggle for public health became one of the defining challenges of the Victorian age. The fight against disease was not confined to the physician's office or the hospital ward. It spilled into the streets, into the homes of ordinary Londoners, and into the very fabric of the city itself. The greatest threat came from epidemic diseases that swept through London with terrifying speed. Cholera was the most feared. It arrived in waves, striking without warning, reducing strong men and women to weakness in a matter of hours. The disease caused violent vomiting and diarrhea, leaving its victims desperately dehydrated. Families watched helplessly as loved ones collapsed, their faces sunken, their skin tinged with blue. Whole neighborhoods were decimated in weeks, coffins lining the streets as undertakers struggled to keep pace. Panic spread each time cholera returned, for no one understood its true cause until later in the century. Many clung to the belief that miasmas, or foul-smelling air, carried the disease, while others suspected bad water but lacked the evidence to prove it was in the midst of these outbreaks that pioneering figures like Dr. John Snow began to make their mark. In 1854, during one of London's worst cholera epidemics, Snow carefully mapped cases in the Soho district and traced them to a single public water pump on Broad Street. By persuading officials to remove the pump handle, he helped stem the outbreak, offering one of the first clear demonstrations that contaminated water, not foul air, was the true cause of cholera. His work laid the foundation for modern epidemiology, though at the time many dismissed his findings. Still, his maps and meticulous records became powerful tools in the fight for cleaner water and better sanitation. Other diseases haunted London as well. Typhus, spread by lice, ravaged the poorest quarters. Tuberculosis, known as consumption, slowly wasted away countless lives, its victims coughing up blood in dimly lit rooms. Smallpox remained a deadly threat, resisted only through vaccination, a practice still controversial and inconsistent. Measles, scarlet fever, and whooping cough claimed children in staggering numbers, filling cemeteries with tiny graves. Each disease left its mark on the city, not only in death tolls, but in the atmosphere of fear that hung over everyday life. Families never knew when illness might strike, and survival often seemed a matter of luck. Public health reforms were born out of these crises, but progress came slowly and with resistance. In the 1830s and 1840s, reports from social reformers began to expose the horrors of London's slums. Overflowing cesspools, uncollected refuse, and water drawn from rivers polluted with human waste. These accounts shocked readers, drawing attention to conditions that many preferred to ignore. One of the most influential figures was Edwin Chadwick, whose 1842 report on the sanitary condition of the laboring population laid bare the links between poor living conditions and disease. Chadwick argued that improving sanitation would not only save lives, but also save money by keeping workers healthy and productive. His work helped push Parliament to establish the first Public Health Act in 1848, a landmark in the state's responsibility for health, yet implementation was uneven. Local boards of health were created, but they often lacked funding and authority. Many landlords resisted reforms that would require costly improvements to housing. Others clung to old beliefs about miasmas, focusing on ventilation and air rather than the more expensive task of rebuilding sewers and water systems. Still, the momentum for change grew, especially as epidemics continued to return. Each outbreak of cholera, each spike in mortality, added urgency to the demand for reform. The Great Stink of 1858 brought matters to a head. That summer, Hot weather intensified the smell of the Thames, which had become an open sewer for the city's waste. The stench was so overpowering that Parliament itself was nearly forced to evacuate its chambers, curtains soaked in lime and vinegar to mask the odor. The crisis could no longer be ignored. Under the leadership of engineer Joseph Bazalgette, London began the monumental task of constructing a modern sewer system, an achievement that would ultimately transform the city's health. By diverting waste away from the Thames and into carefully designed channels, Bazalgette's system dramatically reduced waterborne diseases and laid the foundation for modern sanitation. Public health also extended into housing reform. Philanthropists and reformers pressed for better living conditions, arguing that overcrowded and damp dwellings were breeding grounds for illness. Model housing projects were built, offering cleaner, more spacious accommodations, though these were often beyond the reach of the poorest families. Still, they set an example of what could be achieved, and over time, housing regulations began to improve. Clean water supplies were expanded, refuse collection became more systematic, and streets were gradually cleared of the filth that had once been commonplace for the people of London. These reforms brought gradual but real improvements. Children were still vulnerable, epidemics still struck, but survival rates improved as sanitation spread. Families began to trust that clean water was safer, that sewage could be managed, that disease was not simply an inevitable part of urban life. The idea that the state bore responsibility for health gained ground, reshaping the relationship between government and people. Public health was no longer just a private matter. It was a civic duty, a shared responsibility in a crowded city where one person's sickness could become everyone's crisis. Yet the struggle was never easy. Resistance to vaccination continued, fueled by suspicion and misinformation. Landlords balked at regulations, businesses protested costs, and reformers fought against indifference as much as disease. But the victories were undeniable. By the end of the Victorian era, London was no longer the disease-ridden city of the early 19th century. Its mortality rates had fallen. Its sewers carried waste far from the Thames, and its citizens lived longer, healthier lives. The fight against disease in Victorian London was not won by any single physician, nurse, or reformer. It was the result of countless efforts, from John Snow's maps to Bazalgette's sewers, from Chadwick's reports to the quiet work of nurses tending the sick in crowded wards. It was the story of a city learning, painfully and slowly, that health was not only an individual struggle, but a collective one. And in that recognition lay the foundation of modern public health, built upon the suffering and resilience of millions who lived and died in the great city on the Thames. In the labyrinth of Victorian London, where chimneys smoked and factory bells rang, medicine was not shaped by physicians and surgeons alone. Behind the scenes, and often at the bedsides where suffering was most acute, women played a role so essential that the system could not have functioned without them. Their work was rarely honored in grand publications, and their names seldom appeared in medical journals, yet they formed the backbone of care. Nurses, midwives, caretakers, and even mothers administering remedies at home carried much of the burden of tending to the sick. Their labor, undervalued at the time, would eventually transform medicine into something more humane and organized. At the beginning of the Victorian era, nursing had a grim reputation. Hospitals were overcrowded, sanitation was poor, and nurses were often drawn from the lowest rungs of society. Many lacked training, some were barely literate, and a few were known more for their roughness than their compassion. Accounts from the time describe nurses drinking on duty, neglecting patients, or treating them harshly. In this world, nursing was not a respected profession. It was seen as menial work, dirty and thankless, with little honor attached. Families often preferred to care for their sick at home rather than trust them to hospital wards staffed by such attendants. Yet, even in these early decades, Women carried an unbroken tradition of healing through home remedies and midwifery. Mothers passed down knowledge of herbs, poultices, and simple treatments that had sustained families for generations. In working-class neighborhoods, midwives were trusted figures, guiding births with skill born of experience, though not always with formal training. These women, though excluded from the ranks of official physicians, embodied a practical knowledge of the body that no household could do without. Their contributions, though hidden from the official histories, were central to survival. The transformation of nursing began in earnest with figures like Florence Nightingale, whose experiences in the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, demonstrated the power of sanitation, discipline, and compassion in medical care. Returning to England, she established training schools for nurses, introducing a model of professionalism that emphasized cleanliness, order, and patient dignity. Her influence slowly spread into London's hospitals, where the old image of the drunken or careless nurse gave way to a new ideal: disciplined women in neat uniforms. Tending to patients with a blend of skill and compassion, this change was not immediate. Many hospitals resisted reform, clinging to old practices, and many women found themselves struggling to earn respect in a male-dominated medical world. Yet step by step, the culture of nursing shifted. By the latter half of the Victorian century, trained nurses became symbols of hope for patients, their presence a comfort in wards that had once been feared. They brought with them not only practical skills, but also a sense of order, ensuring that patients were washed, beds were clean, and medicines administered on time. The difference this made in survival rates was profound, even before germ theory was fully embraced. Cleanliness and discipline, introduced through nursing, saved countless lives. For women who became nurses, the work was both demanding and meaningful. Days began before dawn, with rounds of washing, feeding, and tending to patients. Nights were long, often interrupted by cries of pain or emergencies. Nurses bore the emotional toll of constant exposure to suffering and death, yet many found pride in their role, seeing themselves as instruments of mercy in a harsh world. They earned modest wages, lived under strict rules, and were expected to embody moral virtue, for their reputations were tied to the honor of the profession. Nursing, once disreputable, became a calling, attracting women who saw in it both purpose and respectability. Outside hospitals, women continued to shape medicine in quieter but equally vital ways. In countless homes, mothers managed illness with resourcefulness. They brewed teas to ease fevers, applied poultices to infections, and watched over sick children through sleepless nights. Their remedies were sometimes crude, sometimes surprisingly effective, and always born of necessity. For families too poor to afford doctors, such care was the only form of medicine available. In this way, women served as the first line of defense against disease. Their knowledge rooted in tradition and survival. Midwives remained central to community life, guiding the majority of births in an age when maternal and infant mortality was high. Their role carried enormous responsibility, and while their skills varied, many were deeply trusted by families who had known them for years. Physicians occasionally dismissed them as untrained, yet midwives provided services that male doctors often avoided or lacked access to. Entering homes, offering comfort, and supporting women in moments of vulnerability. Their presence represented continuity, a female knowledge of the body passed from generation to generation. Women also played roles in the expanding world of philanthropy and reform. Lady visitors, as they were called, entered hospitals and poor neighborhoods to oversee the care of the sick, bringing with them donations, advice, and supervision. Their work was part charity, part social control, but it contributed to raising standards of care. Women's involvement in public health campaigns, from promoting vaccination to improving sanitation, also grew during this period. Though barred from the ranks of physicians for much of the century, Women influenced medicine through advocacy, reform, and direct care. By the late Victorian era, opportunities for women in medicine began to expand. A handful of determined women fought their way into medical schools, often facing hostility and exclusion. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson became the first woman to qualify as a physician in Britain in 1865, followed by others who challenged the barriers of their time. Their struggles were immense, their numbers small, but their presence signaled a shift that would grow in the decades to come. Women, long confined to the margins of medicine, were beginning to claim their place within its professional ranks. For patients, the growing presence of trained nurses and compassionate female caregivers transformed the experience of illness. A hospital ward, once a place of neglect, became more orderly and humane under the watchful eye of nurses. A sick room at home, once reliant solely on folk remedies, gained from the discipline and cleanliness championed by reformers. Women's touch in medicine, though often undervalued by their male counterparts, softened the harsh realities of Victorian care, bringing comfort where science alone could not. The role of women in Victorian medicine thus spanned the spectrum, from untrained attendants to pioneering physicians, from midwives in crowded alleys to nurses in reformed hospital wards. Their contributions were practical, emotional, and cultural, reshaping how medicine was practiced and experienced. They were not merely assistants to male doctors. They were central figures in the story of care, without whom the system would have collapsed. Looking back, it is clear that the rise of nursing as a respected profession, the persistence of midwives in community life, and the gradual entry of women into medical schools all marked a profound shift. Medicine in Victorian London was transformed not only by scientific discoveries and public health reforms, but also by the steady, often unseen work of women. They brought order to chaos, humanity to suffering, and dignity to patients who might otherwise have been forgotten. Their legacy endures in every ward, every clinic, every profession of nursing that today carries the hallmarks of discipline, compassion, and respect first forged in those challenging years. Victorian London was not only a city of doctors, surgeons, and hospitals. It was also a marketplace, a vast open-air bazaar of remedies, tonics, powders, and promises. Medicine lived not only in polished consulting rooms and crowded wards, but also in the stalls of street vendors, the pages of newspapers, and the bottles sold by quacks who made their living on the hopes and fears of the sick. For every physician with years of training, there was a dozen peddlers ready to sell miracle cures. In a world where disease was common and reliable treatment scarce, the line between genuine medicine and deception was blurred, and ordinary Londoners often turned to whoever promised relief. No matter how unlikely, the streets themselves were alive with the trade. Along busy thoroughfares, vendors shouted the virtues of their powders and syrups. Posters plastered to walls declared that a single pill could cure everything from coughs to indigestion, from melancholy to weakness of the nerves. Hawkers carried baskets of vials, their liquids glowing in the gaslight, while shop windows displayed rows of bottles with labels boasting of exotic ingredients from distant lands. The language of these advertisements was bold, filled with words like miraculous, instant, and guaranteed. For people struggling with illness, such promises were hard to resist. Patent medicines were the most common form of these remedies. Sold in bottles with colorful labels, they claimed to treat a wide variety of conditions. Some contained herbs or harmless syrups, offering at least a little comfort. Many, however, included powerful substances such as alcohol, opium, or mercury. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was widely available without prescription, soothing pain and easing sleep, but quietly fostering addiction. Alcohol-based tonics provided energy and warmth, but often left users dependent. Calomel, a mercury compound, was marketed as a cure for digestive problems, but carried toxic effects. Yet these products sold by the millions, their popularity a testament to the desperation of people seeking any relief in a city where illness was everywhere. Quack doctors flourished in this environment. They adopted titles, sometimes calling themselves professor or doctor, though their qualifications were dubious or non-existent. They advertised in newspapers, using long testimonials from supposed patients who had been cured of everything from consumption to paralysis. They set up shops or roamed the streets, offering consultations for a small fee and selling bottles of their special remedy at inflated prices. Some quacks were skilled showmen, drawing crowds with theatrical performances, producing jars of diseased organs or skeletons as proof of their expertise. Others appealed to secrecy, offering cures for embarrassing conditions in discreet packaging, delivered by post. For many Londoners, quacks filled a gap left by official medicine. Physicians were expensive, hospitals intimidating, and treatments uncertain. A bottle of syrup purchased from a stall, or a pill ordered by mail, seemed easier and more hopeful than enduring the knife of a surgeon or the purges prescribed by a physician. The poor, especially, relied on such remedies, for they were cheaper and more accessible than professional care. Even the wealthy were not immune. Some patent medicines became fashionable, their branding so persuasive that they were accepted in drawing rooms as well as slums. The government made some attempts to regulate this trade, but enforcement was slow and inconsistent. Advertising was rarely controlled, allowing quacks to make outrageous claims without fear of punishment. Newspapers depended on the revenue from patent medicine companies, and so their pages were filled with glowing advertisements. Parliament debated the dangers, especially as addiction to opium-based remedies became more visible, but economic interests often outweighed health concerns. It was not until later in the century that stricter regulations began to curb the worst abuses, yet not all street remedies were fraudulent. Some were rooted in traditional herbal knowledge, offering genuine relief for minor ailments. Chamomile teas for digestion, peppermint for nausea, ginger for colds. These simple treatments had value, and many were passed down through generations. Apothecaries and herbalists operated alongside quacks, their shops filled with plants and roots, their recipes grounded in centuries of practice. The challenge for the public was distinguishing between the useful and the harmful, a task made harder by the flood of competing voices and claims. The world of remedies also reflected the culture of Victorian London itself. Exotic ingredients were marketed with enthusiasm, appealing to the public's fascination with empire and discovery. Tonics boasted of rare roots from India, barks from South America, or minerals from Africa. These claims gave medicines an air of mystery and authority, even when the actual contents were far more mundane. In a city alive with new goods from around the world, remedies became part of the global marketplace, their labels filled with the language of exploration and wonder. For patients, the experience of using such remedies was deeply personal. Some swore by their favorite tonics, convinced that they brought relief. Others suffered in silence when promised cures failed. Families often experimented, keeping bottles of patent medicines in cupboards alongside home remedies, ready for the next cough, fever, or pain. The ritual of taking a spoonful of syrup or swallowing a pill provided comfort in itself, a sense of control in the face of illness. Even when the medicine had little effect, the act of doing something mattered, offering hope where none might otherwise exist. The presence of quacks and street remedies also reveals how fragile trust in official medicine could be. Physicians, with their expensive fees and harsh treatments, often seem no more reliable than a quack selling a bottle for a shilling. When both offered uncertain outcomes, many chose the cheaper, more convenient option. In this way, quackery thrived not only because of deception, but also because of the limitations of legitimate medicine at the time. The failures of physicians created space for charlatans, and the desperation of patients ensured their success. Yet amid the noise and fraud, The age of quacks also carried lessons that shaped the future. The sheer popularity of patent medicines forced governments to confront the need for regulation. The spread of addiction and poisoning spurred debates about safety and responsibility. And the persistence of herbal traditions highlighted the value of remedies drawn from nature, some of which would later be studied scientifically and refined into modern medicines. The Victorian world of quacks and street remedies was chaotic, but out of that chaos came a recognition that health required oversight, honesty, and evidence. In the end, the streets of London were as much a part of medicine as the hospitals and lecture halls. They were places where commerce, desperation, and hope collided, where the sick searched for relief in bottles and powders, where quacks promised miracles, and where the line between healer and deceiver blurred. This world may seem reckless to us now, but for those who lived it, it was simply part of survival. To walk the streets of Victorian London was to walk through a city alive with remedies, some helpful, some harmful, all of them a testament to the enduring human desire to be healed, no matter the cost. In the crowded lanes and fog-draped avenues of Victorian London, where factories roared and horse-drawn carriages clogged the streets, the subject of mental health remained shrouded in silence. Physical illness was spoken of openly, but madness, as it was then called, carried fear, stigma, and shame. Families often hid relatives who suffered from conditions they did not understand, whispering about them behind closed doors. When home care was no longer possible, when behavior grew too disruptive or dangerous, asylums became the final refuge. These vast institutions, sometimes grand in design and other times forbidding in appearance, stood as both symbols of society's attempt to care and of its failure to comprehend. To step inside was to enter a world of isolation, control, and treatment that often reflected more of the era's anxieties than of true healing. At the dawn of the Victorian period, asylums were already established across Britain. Some were publicly funded, others private, catering to wealthy families who could afford to send relatives away. London itself boasted some of the most famous institutions, including Bethlem Royal Hospital, known popularly and notoriously as Bedlam. Its very name had become synonymous with chaos. For centuries, Bedlam had been a place where the disturbed were confined, sometimes chained, often displayed to the curious public who paid a penny to gawk at inmates. By the Victorian era, reforms had softened these cruelties, yet the reputation of Bedlam lingered, a reminder of how society had treated its most vulnerable. Philosophy of mental health care in Victorian London was dominated by the idea of moral treatment. Reformers argued that patients should not be chained or beaten but guided gently back to sanity through order, routine, and moral discipline. Asylums were built with high windows, open grounds, and orderly wards meant to instill calm. Patients were encouraged to follow schedules, rising at the same time, working at small tasks, eating regular meals, and attending church services. The belief was that structure could restore balance to a disordered mind. It was an improvement over the brutality of earlier centuries, yet it was far from cure. Inside the asylum walls, life was a mixture of monotony and control. Patients wore simple uniforms, their individuality stripped away in favor of order. Wards were kept clean, but they were also stark, the air filled with the smell of disinfectant and the echo of footsteps on stone floors. Staff monitored behavior constantly, recording fits of agitation, mutterings, or withdrawal. Treatments ranged from the gentle to the harsh. Some patients were given rest cures, instructed to sleep, eat, and remain quiet. Others endured more invasive methods, cold baths to shock the body, spinning chairs to disorient, or restraints to prevent self-harm. These measures were justified as medical science, though they often reflected the desperation of doctors working without true understanding. The conditions that brought people to asylums were varied. Some suffered from what we would now recognize as depression or anxiety, their spirits broken by grief, poverty, or exhaustion. Others displayed symptoms of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, conditions that baffled physicians of the time. Epilepsy, poorly understood, was often classified as madness. Women in particular found themselves vulnerable to confinement, their emotional struggles labeled as hysteria or nervous disorders. Men who could not maintain employment or who drank excessively might also be sent away, their families relieved to have the burden removed. In many cases, the asylum became less a place of treatment than of social management, a way to hide away those who did not fit the expectations of Victorian order. Despite the limitations, not all was bleak. Some asylums genuinely sought to create healing environments. Gardens were planted where patients could walk in fresh air. Workshops were established to occupy idle hands, and music or reading groups offered moments of comfort. Doctors observed that some patients improved under these conditions, though whether it was due to treatment or simply time away from the stresses of city life remained unclear. Families visited, bringing small gifts or words of encouragement, though visits were often restricted and heavily supervised. For many patients, the asylum was both a prison and a sanctuary, protecting them from the harshness of the outside world while confining them within rigid walls. The public perception of asylums remained mixed. Newspapers occasionally reported scandals of neglect or abuse, stoking fears of cruelty. At the same time, reformers published glowing accounts of modern institutions, describing them as places of order and compassion. The truth often lay somewhere in between. Overcrowding was a constant problem. As London's population grew, so too did the number of patients, stretching resources thin. Staff were overworked, patients outnumbered attendants, and the lofty ideals of moral treatment often collapsed under the weight of reality. Women played a significant role in asylum care, both as patients and as nurses. Female attendants were hired to watch over female wards, providing comfort and enforcing discipline. Their presence was seen as gentler than that of male guards, yet they too were part of a system built on control. For women confined to asylums, the experience was often colored by gender expectations. A wife too outspoken, a mother overwhelmed by childbirth, a daughter unwilling to conform. All could be labeled unstable. Once admitted, it was difficult to leave, as medical authority carried enormous weight. The treatments offered within asylums gradually evolved as the century progressed. Sedatives were introduced to calm agitation, though they often dulled the senses more than they healed the mind. Electrical devices appeared, promising stimulation that might reset mental function, though results were inconsistent and often distressing. Physicians recorded detailed case notes, searching for patterns, but the science of psychiatry remained in its infancy. The language of medicine clothed uncertainty in authority, but cures were elusive. For many patients, the asylum was not a temporary stay but a lifelong sentence. Yet it would be wrong to view Victorian asylums only as places of despair. They represented society's first sustained attempt to treat mental illness systematically, to provide something beyond chains and neglect. The very idea that madness was a condition to be studied and treated, rather than punished, marked a turning point. Though flawed, these institutions laid the groundwork for future understandings, shaping the field of psychiatry for generations to come. For the families of London, the asylum was both a relief and a sorrow. To send a relative there was to admit defeat, to acknowledge that care at home was no longer possible. It was also to accept separation, often permanent. Letters might be exchanged, visits arranged, but the distance was profound. Families carried the weight of guilt and loss, even as they recognized that the asylum offered more care than they could provide. In this way, the history of Victorian asylums is not only medical but deeply human, bound up with love, fear, and the fragile hope of healing to be why the end of the Victorian era. Reforms continued to reshape mental health care. Inspections grew stricter, abuses were exposed, and new theories of psychology began to emerge. The asylum system remained imperfect, but it was no longer the world of Bedlam where inmates were spectacles for the public. It had become a world of routine, discipline, and limited compassion, flawed, but a step towards something better. The story of mental health in Victorian London is thus one of contradictions. It is a story of progress wrapped in misunderstanding, of compassion mingled with control, of attempts at healing overshadowed by confinement. The asylums of the city were places where suffering was contained, where society sought to manage what it could not cure. They remind us how far medicine has come, but also how deeply the human need for care, dignity, and understanding has always existed. In Victorian London, the sound of children's laughter mixed with the roar of factory wheels and the rattle of carriages, but beneath that energy lay a sobering reality. Childhood was precarious. The city's poorest neighborhoods were crowded, damp, and unsanitary, conditions that made disease a constant companion. For every child who ran through the narrow alleys with boundless energy, another lay weak in a darkened room, struggling against illnesses that today are easily cured or prevented. Medicine for children in this period was fragile, often improvised, and shaped as much by poverty and circumstance as by scientific progress. To be a child in Victorian London was to live in the shadow of sickness, and to survive childhood was itself an achievement. Infant mortality rates were staggering. In some districts of London, nearly 1 in 3 children died before reaching their 5th birthday. The causes were many: poor nutrition, contaminated water, unsanitary living conditions, and diseases that spread swiftly through crowded homes. Smallpox, measles, scarlet fever, and whooping cough struck without mercy, often sweeping through entire families. Diarrheal diseases, fueled by tainted milk or spoiled food, carried infants away in days. Tuberculosis consumed young bodies slowly, leaving parents helpless to stop its relentless progress. Each illness carried with it not just pain but fear, for parents knew that the smallest cough or fever might herald tragedy. Medical care for children was often limited. Wealthier families could call upon physicians, who prescribed tonics or arranged for private care, but the poor relied on overworked dispensaries, charitable hospitals, or their own remedies. Mothers carried the burden of treatment, administering teas for fevers, poultices for coughs, or diluted patent medicines that promised relief but often contained dangerous ingredients. Laudanum, the opium tincture sold freely, was sometimes given to restless infants to help them sleep, a practice that soothed in the short term but risked fatal overdoses. Street vendors sold powders advertised as safe for children, though many contained calomel, a mercury compound that poisoned as much as it cured. The line between medicine and harm was often heartbreakingly thin. Children's hospitals began to emerge in the Victorian era, reflecting a growing recognition that the young needed special care. Great Ormond Street Hospital for Sick Children, founded in 1852, was one of the first institutions dedicated solely to pediatric care. Here, physicians and nurses attempted to develop treatments tailored to the needs of children, though their resources remained limited. Beds were few, demand was overwhelming, and survival was never assured. Yet the very existence of such a hospital marked progress, a sign that society was beginning to view children's health as a matter worthy of focus, not merely an afterthought. Vaccination also became an important, if controversial, part of childhood medicine. Edward Jenner's discovery of the smallpox vaccine at the end of the 18th century had offered hope of protection against one of the deadliest diseases. By the Victorian period, vaccination was being promoted more widely, and in 1853 it was made compulsory for infants in Britain. This law sparked resistance, with some parents fearing the procedure, distrusting the state's authority, or objecting on principle. Anti-vaccination movements spread, fueled by skepticism and fear of side effects. Yet despite opposition, vaccination gradually reduced smallpox deaths, saving countless young lives. It was one of the first clear examples of preventive medicine changing the course of childhood survival. Nutrition was another battlefield for children's health. Poor families often subsisted on bread, weak tea, and scraps, diets that left children malnourished and vulnerable. Milk, when available, was frequently contaminated, either by unclean storage or by deliberate adulteration with water and chemicals to increase profit. Campaigns for pure milk emerged as reformers recognized the dangers, but until stricter regulations were enforced, many infants paid the price. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, bent children's legs and weakened their bones, a common sight in the smoky, sunless streets of London. Malnutrition not only stunted growth but also weakened resistance to disease, ensuring that even minor illnesses could turn deadly. Work added another layer of strain to childhood. Many children labored in factories, mines, or as street sellers from a young age. Long hours, poor conditions, and physical exhaustion weakened their bodies, leaving them more susceptible to illness. Injuries were common and medical care rare. Reformers fought to limit child labor and improve conditions, but progress was slow. For countless young Londoners, survival meant balancing work and sickness, their health sacrificed to the demands of poverty and industry. Yet amid hardship, there were glimmers of change. Charitable societies organized efforts to provide clean milk, to open schools that offered not only education but meals, and to distribute clothing and blankets to families in need. Religious missions and philanthropic groups visited poor neighborhoods, bringing medicine and advice, however limited. Doctors began to study childhood diseases more systematically, recording symptoms, outcomes, and patterns. Nursing reforms, inspired by Florence Nightingale, brought more compassionate care into hospitals, including those for children. Slowly, awareness grew that the health of children was not only a family concern but a public responsibility. For children themselves, illness was often endured quietly. Diaries and accounts from the period describe young boys and girls lying in small beds, listening to the sounds of the city outside, or clutching toys as fevers burned through them. Parents hovered anxiously, doing what they could with the means available. Sometimes, recovery came, a cause for celebration and relief. Other times, grief settled over households, as small coffins were carried through the streets to crowded churchyards. The rhythm of life in Victorian London was marked by these cycles of illness and loss, shaping family bonds and community resilience. The struggles of children in Victorian medicine reveal much about the society of the time. They highlight the harshness of poverty, the unevenness of medical care, and the slow emergence of public health reforms. They show how childhood was not protected but precarious, its survival dependent on forces far beyond a child's control. Yet they also illustrate the beginnings of modern pediatrics, the recognition that children required their own kind of care, and the gradual steps toward protecting their health that be why the end of the Victorian era. Improvements in sanitation, nutrition, and vaccination began to reduce childhood mortality. The children of London still faced risks, but their chances of survival were better than those of earlier decades. Hospitals dedicated to children expanded, milk supplies grew cleaner, and the understanding of disease deepened. Childhood was still fragile, but the fight for children's health had begun in earnest. The story of children in Victorian medicine is thus one of struggle and slow progress. It is a story of small bodies battling great dangers, of families doing their best with limited means, of reformers and doctors beginning to see the young as deserving of focused care. It is a reminder that the health of a society is measured not only by the strength of its adults, but by the survival of its children. And in Victorian London, that survival was hard-won, carved out of poverty, sickness, and resilience. Victorian London was a city always on edge, haunted by the specter of epidemics that could sweep through its crowded streets without warning. In an age when science was only beginning to pierce the mysteries of disease, outbreaks carried not just sickness, but deep fear, reshaping how people lived, how they trusted their city, and how they imagined their future. The story of epidemics in this era is not only one of suffering, but also of transformation. As each wave of illness forced society to look closer, question long-held beliefs, and gradually embrace the discoveries that would define modern medicine. Cholera was the most infamous of these threats. Its arrival in London in the early 1830s struck like lightning. Victims were healthy in the morning, then by nightfall lay shrunken and near death, their bodies drained of fluids, their faces drawn and blue. It terrified because of its speed, its seeming randomness, and its brutality. Theories about its cause abounded. Some insisted that miasmas, foul smells rising from the Thames or the open sewers, carried the poison. Others speculated about contagion from contact with the sick. Families sprinkled vinegar, burned herbs, or carried handkerchiefs soaked in perfume, hoping to ward off invisible dangers. Yet still, cholera returned in wave after wave, each outbreak worse than the last. In 1854, the work of Dr. John Snow began to change how people understood epidemics. His careful mapping of cholera cases around Soho, and his demonstration that they centered on a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street, revealed a truth that many resisted. The disease spread through water, not air. By convincing officials to remove the pump handle, he helped to slow the outbreak, offering proof that public health lay in controlling water sources. At the time, his findings were met with skepticism, yet they became one of the great turning points in medical history. Snow's work showed that disease could be studied systematically, traced to causes, and controlled with practical measures. The science of epidemiology was born in the heart of a city racked with fear. Cholera was not alone in its devastation. Tuberculosis, known as consumption, was a slower but equally dreaded killer. It wasted its victims gradually, filling homes with the sound of persistent coughing and staining handkerchiefs with blood. Whole families could be struck, the disease spreading quietly through close quarters. Physicians debated its causes, some attributing it to heredity, others to lifestyle, but without a cure. Treatment was limited to rest, fresh air, and nourishing food, luxuries that few of London's poor could afford. The image of pale, thin patients, often young, became a haunting symbol of the age. Smallpox continued to strike as well, leaving scars on survivors and carrying away many children. Vaccination offered hope, yet it was resisted by some, who feared its side effects or distrusted the state's intervention. Epidemics of measles, scarlet fever, and typhus added to the toll, each leaving grief in its wake. For families living in cramped tenements, these diseases were a constant threat, spreading swiftly through shared air and contaminated water. For the wealthy, retreating to the countryside offered some protection, but even they were not immune. Epidemics crossed boundaries of class, though they struck hardest at the poor. Fear shaped behavior as much as illness itself. When outbreaks occurred, people avoided gatherings, shunned neighbors who showed signs of sickness, and fled the city if they could. Rumors spread faster than the diseases, filling newspapers and taverns with speculation. Quacks thrived in such moments, selling cholera cures or consumption tonics that promised protection. Some turned to religion, interpreting epidemics as punishment or as tests of endurance. Others looked to science, hoping that physicians might unlock the secrets of contagion. In this climate of uncertainty, trust was fragile, and the line between knowledge and guesswork thin. Epidemics also reshaped the city itself. The recurring waves of cholera, combined with the infamous Great Stink of 1858, forced Parliament to act. The building of Joseph Bazalgette's vast sewer system was not only an engineering triumph, but a direct response to the terror of disease. By channeling waste away from the Thames and providing cleaner water supplies, the system drastically reduced outbreaks, demonstrating that infrastructure could save lives as surely as medicine. It was proof that public health required collective effort, not just individual remedies. Science was changing rapidly in these years. The old belief in miasmas gave way, slowly, to the acceptance of germ theory. The work of scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch on the continent began to influence British medicine. Joseph Lister's antiseptic methods, introduced in the 1860s, were part of this new understanding, showing that invisible organisms caused infection and could be controlled through cleanliness. Each discovery chipped away at fear, offering explanations where once there had only been mystery. Yet acceptance was not immediate. Many resisted new ideas, clinging to older theories, and progress was uneven. The shift from fear to knowledge was gradual, often frustratingly so. For ordinary Londoners, the impact of epidemics was deeply personal. Families buried children, parents, and neighbors, their grief woven into the daily life of the city. Funeral processions became common sights, churchyards filled, and cemeteries expanded to accommodate the losses. The memory of epidemics lingered long after outbreaks subsided, shaping how communities thought about health and survival. Fear became part of identity, a shadow that hung over the crowded city. Yet so too did resilience. Each epidemic was endured, each loss mourned, and life continued amid the ever-present risk. The story of epidemics in Victorian London is thus one of duality. It is a story of fear, of sudden death, of invisible threats, of helplessness. But it is also a story of progress, of science slowly uncovering truth, of cities reshaped to protect their people, of medicine moving from guesswork to evidence. Epidemics forced London to confront its vulnerabilities, and in doing so, they propelled it toward modernity. By the end of the Victorian era, the face of science had changed dramatically. Where once physicians spoke of miasmas, they now spoke of microbes. Where once families sprinkled vinegar in their homes, they now trusted sewers and sanitation. Fear remained, for disease could never be banished entirely, but knowledge had grown, and with it, hope. The epidemics that terrorized London had left scars, but they had also left lessons. Lessons that shaped not only the city's health, but the very foundations of modern medicine. As the gas lamps of Victorian London flickered and the city's restless noise softened into the night, the story of medicine in that age comes to a gentle close. It was a story woven from shadows and light, from the fears of epidemics to the triumphs of discovery, from the cries in crowded hospitals to the quiet care of nurses by the bedside. Victorian medicine was never simple, never certain, and often never safe. Yet it marked a turning point, the moment when science began to outgrow superstition, when public health became a responsibility of the state, and when care slowly shifted from neglect to compassion. That we have walked through hospitals where surgeons prized speed over precision, through homes where mothers dosed infants with dangerous syrups, and through streets where quacks shouted promises of cures that never came. We have entered the asylum, with its mixture of order and despair, and stood in the slums where children fought against hunger and disease with fragile bodies. We have seen epidemics strike fear into millions, yet we have also witnessed the steady rise of sanitation, vaccination, and antiseptic practice. Each chapter has revealed not only the pain of the age, but the resilience of its people, ordinary Londoners who endured, adapted, and hoped for better days. The legacy of Victorian medicine is not only in the textbooks of science, but in the everyday lives it touched. The great sewer systems beneath the city, still carrying waste away today, were born of fear but became symbols of progress. The nursing profession, raised from disrepute to honor by discipline and compassion, continues to carry Florence Nightingale's torch. The hospitals that once reeked of infection became the foundations of modern institutions: cleaner, safer, more humane. Even the failures, the quacks, the toxic patent medicines, the harsh treatments played their role, for they reminded society of the need for evidence, honesty, and reform. Looking back, it is easy to judge the Victorians by what they did not know. But their struggle was the struggle of transition, to move from the mysteries of old beliefs into the clarity of new science. They did not yet have the antibiotics, the advanced surgery, or the precise diagnostics we now take for granted. What they had was determination, to learn, to try, to experiment, and to keep seeking answers in the face of loss. That persistence is their true gift to us, and so, as we leave the narrow alleys and shadowed wards of Victorian London behind, we carry with us the quiet reminder that medicine is not only about cures and instruments, but about humanity itself. It is about the dignity of patients, the compassion of caregivers, and the collective effort of societies to protect the vulnerable. The Victorians stumbled, they erred, but they also paved the way for us. May this journey through their world settle gently into your thoughts tonight, like the soft dimming of a lamp. And before you drift away into rest, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. It helps keep these calming histories alive and allows us to continue exploring the forgotten corners of the past together. Sleep well, and let the lessons of history remind you that even in the darkest times, people have always sought light.